And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hey, Josh. Hey, everyone.
Oh,
We got started a
it's
little late. Got started a little late on Instagram and had to go with a couple of technical issues, but we
that's
are
right.
glad to be here. And I'm very thankful that my air conditioning is working.
Oh, absolutely. Mine too. For people who are not in the Ozarks, summer has indeed arrived before the solstice.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what the high was, but what I checked just an hour ago, it was still 91. So
Yeah, yeah. It's nearly hot, and by nearly hot, I mean it is hot.
yes. And on that note, let's start talking about people digging into caves and mounds, probably very hot weather.
Absolutely, and very so well. In terms of our subject, this is a I think it's a really interesting subject. It's playing between kind of existent history over in one corner, um, folklore, and then really the intersection of the two in Middle America.
I agree. I agree. And for the record, we're talking about giant lore and
Yeah.
runestone, something that seems a little bit more akin to fairy tales in Germany, but in
Hmm.
Scandinavia, but uh, there's a long history of giant lore in America, including those are.
Including the Ozarks. And I think as an interesting disclaimer, everything that we're getting ready to discuss um, gets dismissed on a semi-regular basis.
Yes, it does, and in some parts justly so. Um, but for me, it's more the sociological aspect that is very fascinating of why these subjects keep coming up, um, especially throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, and why they did the way they did.
Yes, and as with all, this. I think I made up the term. It may already have been made up by somebody else. Crypto anthropology. Of course, we have
Mhm.
cryptozoology. To me, this falls into the category of crypto anthropology, and to a certain degree, you might even say crypto history, with the runes,
Yes,
with
yes.
the runestones. I find this incredibly fascinating because the suggestion is that there was evidence of a history that perhaps did not fit the narrative that was chosen for our history,
Correct.
and that there is a cognitive dissonance between those two narratives, and choosing one gives you a certain amount of staid respectability,
Mhm.
and one of them gets you labeled a crackpot. And so there's an enormous amount of good old high school style peer pressure, perhaps at the academic or peer level, uh, to make sure that everybody keeps on the right page. And if documentable objects begin appearing that that are in conflict with the narrative, that you dismiss them as hoaxes.
That's correct. And but it's not quite that simple, and it really comes up in an issue of institutional inertia and jealousy.
Hmm.
Uh, and the we've talked about this with Ozark folklorists like Vance Randolph, um, sort of the dichotomy of the East Coast, intellectual professionals on a subject versus everyone else.
Yes.
And there is an element of that as well.
I think so. Now, I love the term that you just used. I'd like to talk a little bit more about its definition. I think I understand it, but institutional inertia. Tell me about that.
Institutional inertia is basically once an institution wants to continue the status quo,
Hmm.
you know, is resistant to change, is resistant to challenges of dissonant ideas. An identity grows up around the methodology, the pedagogy of a subject area, and so the institution does not want to change.
Right.
And
Right.
that really was the case in the 1900s and early 20th century, or early the 19th century and early 20th century, with
Hmm.
anthropology and so forth,
Yes.
and archaeology.
So, and of course, not then just a previous by like 10 minutes previous conversation, I was giving the devil's advocate side on this, which I really enjoy as well. The 19th century in North America was rife with P.T. Barnum style hoaxes that became incredibly popular. That Cardiff Man obviously is one example, but throughout Europe and in North America, these outlandish quote unquote discoveries to get the masses excited, particularly to get them to buy a ticket to something, a gallery exhibition, not of Billy Cook, and they proved that there's, as P.T. Barnum said, there's a sucker born every minute. And so within that, I think the ideas of cryptoanthropology certainly could falter under a direct gaze, and just say, look, this is not part of the narrative. Every bit of this is simply being made up for attention. That is, a simplified version of that opposition.
It is, and in the framework of the sort of the institutional story from universities and professionals, was that civilization in North America went back several thousand years, but to the Neolithic, but not that far back. And so anything that seemed different than pretty much then current Indian civilization didn't seem to fit the narrative at that time.
Right. Right. And I think that the danger of that type of inertia is the fact that then especially, but even now, we have, I say it's easy to assess that we do not have enough information to effectively understand Neolithic cultures in North America to the degree to dismiss much.
That's true. Now, the flip side is that there are multiple possible explanations that
Right.
go beyond the sensational and
Yeah.
fantastic. But
Yeah. Although that's fun. And now flipping
yeah.
back to the other side, I love the folkloric sensational.
Oh, well, I do too.
I admittedly love the idea that at some point there was a race of giants gallivanting in a civilized manner over North America, and now they're all dead, and a number of people have dug up their skeletons, sometimes by accident.
Well, I think it's the same way with say Greek mythology and the Cyclops and so forth. They and they think that those stories probably came from finding pachyderm skeletons, and
Hmm.
because of the horn, there's a large nasal cavity, and it would be easy to interpret as a single eye. Um,
Yes.
and so I think there's this vicarious um, thrill, not necessarily thrill, but desire to, oh, there was something fantastical here, just like the stories from Europe, the Greeks or the Germans or the Norse, of these fantastical beings, and we're in a new world, and we could have our own sort of set of fantastical beings, even if it's a
Agreed.
platonic desire.
In you mentioned the sociological aspect. I don't think you can talk about the sociological aspect without including the potential of Jungian archetypes.
True.
Within that, we have settlers coming into North America. To such a large degree, the United States of America is an incredibly fragile young nation
Mm-hmm.
with very little, comparatively speaking, heritage and history in the larger scheme of civilization,
Mm-hmm.
if you can call any of us civilized. And that within that structure, I think that I think it could be expected to be wanting to find some sort of larger sense of meaning within place,
Mm-hmm.
within each respective frontier. And Missouri, of course, was a frontier. That need to almost to understand the world around you within mythological terms.
Yes. And again, I think that can happen even if you're not really conscious of that process. Um,
Yes, yes.
we want to delve
And
into
sometimes,
specifically the giants or first, or
yeah, I think so. I think particularly I think sometimes it happens most powerfully when we aren't aware of it.
oh, I think so too. Our conscious gets in the way sometimes.
It does. It does. And when we do develop an awareness of the potential of archetypes, of the potential, the understanding the importance of myth, it does allow us to disassociate a little bit and say, well, I recognize why I'm feeling like this. Maybe there's 6 other potential reasons for that, but I recognize its value, whether those reasons are true or not.
Exactly. Exactly. And so when we look at giant stories, there are a number of them across America, um, whether they were hoaxes or things that are mistaken, or really larger than normal skeletons. Um,
Yes. And
uh,
in all cases of the current documentation that we have, we are dealing with essentially archaeological finds. We're not actually dealing with somebody running across a giant.
that's true. It's mainly what people are finding that was buried, that them trying to explain something. Um, and in the Ozarks, typically you had two situations. You had either mounds, which came from the mound building civilization, which
Yes.
predated the tribes that settlers found in the area. And then also cave, bluff dwelling or cave dwelling burials.
Yes. Yes. And in interestingly enough, we'll take a couple of specific examples right off the bat. One in both of these from Missouri, one in Versailles,
Mm-hmm.
or near Versailles, and one of them near Steelville,
Mm-hmm.
for people who may not be familiar, we're dealing with the upper Missouri Ozarks, which is in central Missouri, but the upper cusp of the Ozarks. And in one case, a mound, what most likely, I would not, it's a cursory opinion, but I would say a Neolithic mound site.
Yes, that's
The
what it sounds like.
the 1933, I believe, article, was it 33, 1929?
33 or 34.
Okay, for sales, I think, for the
Mhm.
for sales article, mentions that it possibly might have been the Osage. That's not impossible, but I would typically associate and again, this is a cursory reading, but I would associate the mounds with the Neolithic peoples that preceded the Siouan people or the
Mhm.
Lakota dialect peoples in Middle America, just as the potentially similar, I suppose, the Neolithic, your traditional fairy mounds, your henges, um, et cetera, your dolmens in the British Isles
Mhm.
were that they preceded the Celts. The Celts really, I think it's fair to say that the Celts would have been approximately contemporaries of the what we think of as disparate First Nation peoples.
Mhm.
That and so of course we're rolling back the clock to Neolithic peoples that we really don't have names for.
Right, right. We don't know much. And in the case of the mound near Versailles, Mr. Crane had a property, I think 270 acres, and he decided to build a house and didn't. And I would love to know. I would love to know exactly where it was and why he built it with a mound in his front yard, but he did, and decided that the mound and the trees on top of it blocked his view. So he started out cutting down the trees, and they were mature trees that they counted rings and estimated to be at least 100 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So that put it back to the early 1800s at least.
Yes.
And then the mound was still blocking his view, so he basically was leveling part of it. And it does not sound like he assumed when he started that it was a burial mound or anything.
Correct.
Um,
Correct. And
and
I want to interject really quickly. A lot of these ancient mound sites look like natural formations.
that's true. That's true. And it wasn't until people started moving dirt that they started realizing, oh, this is what's going on. And
Right, because they started finding human remains.
exactly. And he did 7 bodies, in fact.
Yes.
6 seemed to be normal sized adults. The 7th was categorized as potentially a giant in excess of 8 feet tall.
Yes.
Uh, and certainly unusual. And I think that's where some people suggested perhaps it was a member of the Osage tribe because they tended to be taller than other First Nation people overall.
Right. Right. And if you now I'm gonna counter myself in this regard. If the oak trees, because it said there were 5 oak trees on the mound. They were all appeared to be of approximately the same age. The idea that the oak trees would have been associated with this as a sacred site, if they indeed were of the same age. I mean, if they were there as part of that mound,
Right.
that even if they're very, very old, that still most likely places them at less than 200 years old. That puts it in comparatively recent history. And who was in that area at that time. It was predominantly the Osage. So it may not be a Neolithic site.
It might not, but it seemed to be that one doctor in the area looked at the bones and did conclude that they were very old, and so tended to believe that the burial was predated the trees. So
Interesting.
so that being the case, we're not really sure at this point because there wasn't an archaeological study done. But I do have to hand it to Mr. Crane. He did handle things a little more delicately than a lot of those situations were handled. He leveled the mound down to the height that he was comfortable with, and then reinterred the bones, and basically in an ossuary, dug a deep pit in the remaining part of the mound and buried them. And so if we could find that, we could have better answers. Unfortunately, over the passage of time, the land was sold. It was partitioned off, and apparently the house is no longer, and no one is exactly sure where his house was in order to be able to locate where his porch was to face onto where the mound would have been. So at this point, no one has found those remains again in order to be tested.
Right. A lot of moving parts on that. Something that really jumped out to me, and I think it would be interesting to dig into more just from a social standpoint. I think it was, and I'm very intrigued by the trees. I am very intrigued by the trees. The possibility that the trees may simply have grown there naturally. Oaks, white oaks grow all over the Ozarks. And there realistically might be nothing of particular significance over that. The other idea that they might have been curated by potentially the Osage, with the understanding that that this was a sacred site that predated their own civilization. Something that I've also found really interesting. It might be unfair, but I cannot help but make comparisons between, and of course, what I'm going to say is really strikes at the point of patent ridiculousness. We call this the New World, and we're talking about ancient Neolithic peoples. There's nothing new about it, but the fact that as an example, when the Celts arrived in the British Isles, they regarded so many of these Neolithic locations as sacred sites, sites to be assumed, that reverence was assumed, that liminal space oftentimes was applied to the site. They understood that these were important in a broader cosmology. And perhaps it is unrealistic or unfair, but I personally cannot help but draw a point of comparison that I believe that many of the First Nation people for whom we have names could not have helped but to have made similar comparisons to Neolithic sacred sites.
Well, and we do know that at the Spiral Mounds along the Arkansas River, just inside Oklahoma, in the Ozarks, that was the case. That the First Nations people that ended up with that property did view them as important places, and basically they gave birth to them, didn't disturb the land around them, and had experiences such as seeing floating balls of light, hearing sounds of voices or drums, that kind of thing, and animals being spooked. So so it's very, I think it's very likely that that would have happened at other locations, such as the one at Versailles.
Yes, which I find really fascinating. Now, jumping not very far over from Fazales is Steelville,
Yes,
and in the Steelville area, we have a story that is marked in its similarities, but also in its differences. The first big difference is we're dealing with a cave instead of a mound.
yes, Pluggett's Cave. Again, farmer owned the land,
Hmm.
and he had grown up on the property. Family had owned it for a couple of generations, I believe, and and he remembered as a boy playing in it, and that they had determined, they thought that it had been used a as a cave dwelling site for a long time, because there was charcoal and ash and soot that was 2 or 3 feet deep towards the front of the cave. And so, that part didn't seem to be a surprise to him. Um, then teenage boy accidentally found the burial, which basically they described as towards the front of the cave. There was sort of a corner that this body was buried in a kneeling position,
Yes.
and that again, that the height was well over 8 feet, and also pottery and so forth was found that did not seem to belong to First Nations people in the area,
Yes.
which
Yes.
would indicate perhaps it was older.
Right.
And this one, um, there was examination of the teeth and so forth, that um, the pattern of wear and so forth would indicate that uh, the diet and so forth indicated to um, the doctors that looked at it, that it was definitely an older burial. But they also described it as a very heavy brow, etc., a stoutly built uh, person.
Yes.
And
Was that the one that also said that he had a very small head?
yes, yes. So I'm not sure if perhaps there was some congenital condition or encephalitis or something. I don't know. Um, but apparently from the description, it was someone that was well cared for and had a very caring burial. So,
Yes.
um, and there was notation that there was a review of the body by someone from the Smithsonian.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think it is interesting in some of the literature I reviewed, that one thing to note is sometimes people would, they caution of not assuming the height being what it was in death, in the burial, because the bones sometimes are further apart than they are in life, that kind of thing, so it will look more elongated. But on the other hand, then say the Versailles or the Versailles site, you have sits that are normal height and then one that isn't. So is it just one that was affected that way? I mean, I just find that curious. Is that a way to just say we don't want to deal with this potential issue? And how much difference in height is it going to be before people are going to say, obviously the bones are scattered or have been moved in the dirt over time?
Yes. There's again, there's a lot of moving parts. I'm gonna uh, open up the trap door of conspiracy theories
Okay.
for a moment. I believe, and I have not read much on this, so I'm just throwing this out there, that there are some accounts, perhaps not in the Ozarks, but certainly some accounts of evidence like this being uncovered, getting it shipped off to an authority, and then simply disappearing.
And there does seem to be those situations that the Smithsonian and other institutions just kind of, oh, we got another box of bones. We kind of put it in the back and forget about it, and then just don't reply to the people. And then there's some people who say, well, this was a concerted effort to conceal that there's a, you know, a longer history in America, because it contradicts the current idea of migration of people
Mm-hmm.
to North America, that kind of thing. Or, versus we're getting these things and this is low on the priority list of what I have to do, and it sits in the back room till the point that people go, oh, it's been sitting here 10 years. It's hard to know. I'm sure there may be a little bit of both.
Yeah, I think that's potentially quite fair, and I I love the idea of. I honestly love the idea of counter narratives.
Mm-hmm.
Is simply from an archetypal, sociological, or folkloric standpoint, because I do think that they enrich our view of place.
I think so, and I think there's been sort of a resurgence of interest in this topic in the last 20, 30 years. People, oh, they've hidden this history from us, kind of thing, and it just evokes to me the last scene in Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, of the crate being pushed into this massive warehouse to never be seen again. And
Yeah.
I think there is a little bit of degree of wishful thinking of, oh, we know the real truth,
Oh yeah.
you haven't hidden it from us. And I think that's just a perfect visual example of that innate curiosity that we have.
I agree. I really do. And so I think that would be an interesting point. We can come back to some of the Arkansas stuff in a moment, but jumping over to yet another historical counter narrative, which is the runestone in Oklahoma.
Heavener Runestone, yes, near Heavener, Oklahoma. And it's massive, for one thing. It's huge. I think it's 12 feet tall, and I forget how many feet wide, but it's a very large stone that has what appears to be rune stones.
Yes.
Runes carved on it.
And very specifically for people who might be unfamiliar with the concept of runes, what it is implying in the most simplest terms is Vikings in the Oklahoma Ozarks pre-Columbian.
Yes. And if you think that giants seem to be controversial with experts, it's almost as if this notion is even more so, that no, there were not explorations that we don't know of.
And I find, while I don't know if the Avener runestone is a runestone, so I want to be very clear in this particular point. I do not have a personal associative dog in this fight.
I don't either.
If it is great, if it isn't great, either one is totally fine by me. That said, height of arrogance to simply say there could not have been exploration into North America that we don't know about.
Exactly. I mean,
the entire point of an unknown exploration is that we don't know about it.
That's that's very true.
There's nothing in this book that could have been omitted. How do you know?
Because I guess everyone assumes that they would have gone home and said, "Hey."
It was a very big world in those days.
Yes.
They might not have made it home.
Exactly. You just don't know. And I have, there are experts in runes and so forth, and Ogham. Ogham is an alphabet that in various forms used by ancient Irish, and a similar alphabet used by Germanic tribes very
Yes.
early on. Uh, but I've read resources that say, "Oh, these are not runes. These are not Oghams. These are someone has just come up with something that kind of looks like them." I've read others that say, "Yes, these are dead on," but they can't be real because the form of the runes are from 700, and I've even read from 700, and the ocean explorations didn't start to 750, so that couldn't be it. It can't be, so I don't know.
I, I think again, realistically, um, the potential of what we know as accounted to, certainly for the time, a highly sophisticated seafaring race
Hmm.
that we know, comparatively speaking, not long after 700. Certainly by 900, we were um, seeing attempted invasions across the North Sea. Um, we had ancient peoples, ancient Northern Europeans, traversing to Iceland and Greenland. We
Hmm.
know that the
Yes.
that that is not conjecture. The idea that if if a group of northern Scandinavians could have made it to Greenland, the idea that they could have made it to the eastern seaboard,
Hmm.
and then potentially moved inland.
Well, once
Uh,
they got to Newfoundland, there was a settlement there, so once they made it that far, the rest would have been easier
yes,
in some
uh,
respect. So
and you are also dealing with with individuals with the capacity for self-defense that would have made them realistically a lot more difficult pickings than most of the European settlers that would have come several hundred years later.
very true, very true. You have to look at them. They were more akin to the Spanish conquistadors in the
Yes.
1500s or late 1400s
Hmm.
than
But
than settlers.
yes, but moving probably faster than the conquistadors.
Probably, probably.
I
And
think. Go ahead.
well, one
Go ahead.
thing that I find interesting is they have accounts that First Nation people um, of seeing the stone and verifying that the stone was there in the early 1800s. So if it was
Hmm.
a hoax, you're still looking at 18th century, you know, or earlier. And then I have to think the counterpoint is, of course, the legends of the Spanish gold in the Ozarks and in Oklahoma. And there is no, there are no markers, there nothing for that, but someone is going to stop in the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma and carve a 12-foot stone.
That, to me, that is More of a breach of logic than the idea of a wayward Viking band around 700 AD 700.
Well, yeah, if you're just talking about what makes practical common sense, why would they have done it? At least the Vikings would have been, foraging or looking for um, uh, gold or whatever, or deciding whether or not they wanted to stay,
Yes.
versus um, something along those lines. And if and again, if the Spanish didn't make a you know, a a similar land claim by marking something, why in the why would someone have gone to the trouble of trying to do that in the 1700s when they really were in the middle of nowhere?
Yes. There's the I think in terms of the hoax aspect of the runestones in Oklahoma, you would almost have to make the argument that it had to have been done in the later 19th or early 20th century for it to culturally make sense.
Hmm.
And I think we have documentation that it was already there before then.
Yeah, that it was there, at least in the early 1800s. And
Hmm.
so yeah, to me it doesn't make sense. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not a hoax, or I mean, stranger things have happened, people have done stranger things throughout history, but it just doesn't seem to make the most sense of, it's not like it's a small, a 2 foot square stone with some markings on it. I mean,
Yeah.
someone went to a lot of trouble.
Yes. And this is conjecture, perhaps logical conjecture, but I like to think of this as a group of Vikings that, for whatever reason, or what we know of as Vikings, that for whatever reason, Scandinavian peoples, seafaring peoples from Northern Europe, that perhaps knew they were never going home.
Well, that's true. Maybe, that, to me, that makes more sense of having something that's a reference point, a reminder of home in some way, for themselves.
And the sense, I think it speaks very powerfully, potentially. None of us want to be forgotten.
Very true.
If you obviously it's the same reason we create tombstones, but
That's exactly what I was just thinking.
the idea, something I was thinking of was quite facetious when we were talking about the fact that there's potentially no record of exploration, and maybe they never made it back. I'm going, from a point of omission. What do these people want? A receipt from the round trip airfare.
Exactly. Or something, receipts, for furs purchased from from native.
That's
Yeah, I mean,
we're
um,
we're we're talking about 8700 in all general likelihood thereabouts. You're not going to find a paper trail. But that said, you look at the immense miles, which certainly were possible to um, for people who would be, to put it in very blunt terms, who were this tough. And we know that a number of ancient peoples were this tough to be able to survive this sort of thing. But what if, in a variety of ways, or perhaps for a variety of unknown reasons, but you also have to take into mind the thousands of miles between Scandinavia and Oklahoma. When you look at that, the very real possibility that after this extraordinary expedition, these individuals were looking at each other and realizing they were not going home. And at that point,
either that, or perhaps they, you know, decided to stay and were intermarrying with native peoples too. You know, you just don't know.
yes, and that the very human desire not to be forgotten. What would you do? Create a monument that would last beyond you.
You know, why did astronauts leave photos on the moon?
Yeah.
You know, I
Yeah.
mean, it's very, you know, on that level, it's very much the same thing. You could even argue it's the same thing as including the golden record on Voyager. I mean, you
Yes,
know, do you need that in addition to the probe itself? I mean, it's a very human, egocentric trait.
it is. It is something as simple as saying, "Please remember me."
Hmm. If this is
And
still here, then I'm not completely forgotten if someone sees it.
yes, and I think I realize that what we're discussing is purely conjecture, and a
Hmm.
variety of sources have quote unquote debunked or dismissed the Havener Stone. But just from a purely human narrative, I find it very beautiful of the idea that individuals are talking about this. We're talking about this. If that is the case, then those individuals are remembered.
Exactly, and I think it's apropos that the state has made a state park around it,
Yes.
and
Yes,
so,
very much so.
you know, in that sense, then whether it's a hoax or whether it was Vikings or um, you know, ancient monks or whoever, um, then it's remembered. You know,
Yes.
and the idea, the story, I think ultimately is more powerful than anything else, and it's a connection to other times, other places, um,
Mm,
which I think when you think about, you mentioned the idea of the new world, for people who came over here, it was new to them,
yes.
and often leaving so much behind that, you know, some sort of connection is natural.
It is. It is. And wanting that connection,
Well, yeah. So,
it's only human. It's only human.
but we get very tied up into, we have, you know, it has to be this or that. Well, if you're looking at it from an archaeological or anthropological perspective, yes. But if you're looking at it from storytelling and just the remembered cultural significance, it's different.
It is. It is. It really is. I like topics like this. You know, at the onset, I like it because it's folkloric and sensational and exciting. But when we pull it back around, it really becomes very introspective.
Hmm. I think so.
And I find that I find it fascinating, but I think what is most powerful is it reminds us of the 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 real crux of the issue, which is telling human stories reminds us of our own humanity. It reminds us to be more open-minded and more aware of the world around us. And that's a much better place to be.
Well, it's a better place. At least that's the place I would rather be in.
It's a you know, and perhaps the less dark side of manifest destiny was that America is a land of opportunities. I think that there's a great deal of opportunities left in terms of remaining in terms of what's possible for the human narrative.
I think so. And I think one thing that we romanticize a lot in that respect is that, oh, opportunities were easier then, for whatever reason. But whether it's because there were fewer people, there was less competition, or just that basically everything that we are accustomed to hadn't happened yet. But on the flip side, when you start delving into these stories, the people went through such hardships and such tragedy. The fact that they were able to make use of opportunities is amazing at times.
It is. It is. I think we we often times do not give enough credit to our forebears for the amount of effort that they went into. So in some cases, simply to survive. In other cases, to build the world that we now take for granted.
Exactly. Exactly. And maybe we should turn back around to Arkansas just a little bit, that the
Yes.
Arkansas Ozarks were not left out in this subject. There were mounds there as well as caves, and there were actually some of the accounts there kind of predate Missouri a lot, other than maybe some of the mounds in St. Louis itself, because St. Louis
Hmm.
settled so much earlier by the French. But
Yes.
and a lot of people don't realize that there were a number of mounds in St. Louis in that region that were cut down. Um, but in Arkansas, a lot of mounds were found in the 1860s, 1870s, and very similar stories. They'd find these remains, and they were larger than expected, and so they just assumed that it was a race of giants, and the connection with the Bible often was made.
Yes. Yes. And from just purely from a sociological standpoint or folklore standpoint, I love that connection. I think it's very fascinating. And, finding again our, hardy European settlers with oftentimes, an axe in one hand and a Bible in the other, trying to find their place in this world.
Mm-hmm. But
And
it for them, that the narrative they had grown up with suddenly, oh, there may be physical verification.
yes, yes.
I'm sure it was
And
ready.
it, is really fascinating. I do find it, again, I just find it interesting. These, in some cases, these excavations, these archaeological finds, were not particularly sensationalized, but they were documented in local newspapers.
Yes, they were, and there are times that there were some that seem to have been um, used as propaganda. There was one early one that basically was used to try to cast aspersions on the reputation of a mine owner, saying that they had found these, giant bones in the mine, and attributing the statements to the mine owner, who happened to not even be in town at the time. And eventually the statements were retracted, and uh, and it had no effect. And it simply was sort of someone that was jealous, or a competitor trying to get a leg up. Um,
Yes.
and so, yeah, you did have some of those situations, and that turned out definitely to be one of those. and
Yes.
it was southeastern Missouri. I forget exactly the location, but um, but these other stories don't have that same quality to them.
No. No.
And I,
I
and I
there's
found it I found it interesting that the newspapers seem to sort that out pretty quickly. Within a few days, it was pretty clear. Oh, this was made up, and
Mhm.
why, and it just kind of wilted away, and then didn't have any effect. So uh, the idea that these stories were just put out there and everyone just believed anything, I don't think is realistic either.
I don't think so. I totally agree with that. And something that our mm, I would say, I'm gonna go off on a soapbox for a moment. Uh,
Okay.
I'm gonna say our since the 1990s obsession with buying computer equipment equals uh, an improvement of academia, and we there seems to be the assumption that there is a 1-to-1 ratio between being able to use a smartphone effectively and us progressing as a human race. Um, and we on one level we sort of seem to accept this as an idea, and at another level we all know, we all have objective proof that that is not the case. And so with that inured idea comes, I think, a false assumption that we far too oftentimes do not check ourselves on. So when we go back and we're reading documentation from the 19th century, for example, there is a false assumption that somehow the individuals writing the stories, the individuals publishing the newspapers, etc., are somehow less evolved than we are because they didn't have TV, or they didn't have smartphones, or they didn't have Google. And I would counter that well, first of all, I think we have documentable proof that human beings have scarcely changed for a very long time. And so, and that's both good and bad. Um, but that you really begin to view historical documentation very differently when you remove or disassociate yourself from that false assumption, and you begin to look and realize and accept the reality that these were people who were as sophisticated, if in some cases not a great deal more sophisticated than we are today.
Mhm.
Therefore, it places us in a very difficult position that some of these things, and these newspaper reports are a great example of that, that we can no longer simply dismiss them as a primitive people with, a backwoods newspaper. There's more to it than that.
There is. I mean, if we want to go by that standard, I think a lot of people are in trouble right now for some things that they're willing to buy hook, line, and sinker without any research.
Yes.
Um, I don't think people really want to go down that road. Oh, another thing that we forgot to mention on the Steelville case
Yes.
with the cave, I thought it was interesting that a reporter asked Mr. Plunkett specifically if he was worried about being haunted by the ghost of the
Of the
giant that
mound.
dug up,
Yes.
and he seemed to be just perplexed, like, why would I be? I just
I
I
caught
liked
that.
that.
I did too. I thought that was fantastic.
A very practical, just like, well, why would I be afraid?
Yes. Oh, and classic, and I'm speaking for myself here. Classic journalism question. Are you afraid of the ghost?
Mhm.
What ghost? Uh, I that said, I'm very, very interested in the paranormal reports that do seem to be associated with these mounds. You did mention some of those already. I do
Mhm.
think that's incredibly interesting.
I do, but I guess in this particular one, he and his family had been there for a long time and had made use of the cave and everything. He'd been in there since he was a kid, and he was like, "Well, what ghost? What are you talking about?"
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. Really, really positive. Yeah, I love it. I
I do
love it.
too.
Oh, good times tonight.
It is fun subject, and hopefully other people enjoyed. And if you have things that you're interested in, let us
Yes,
know. We're happy to talk about them, and
absolutely.
we'll be back here next week.
Yes, we will. We look forward to it.
And thank everybody, and thank you, Josh.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. Appreciate y'all.
Good night.
Night.